The most dangerous people in the galaxy are usually the ones nobody recognizes. The transport shuttle emerged from hyperspace surrounded by nothing except darkness, distant stars, and the pale glow of Kari's Prime's outer defense grid. Most travelers never remembered Border Station 12. There was nothing memorable about it. The station hung above the planet like a forgotten piece of machinery abandoned between worlds. Its corridors were narrow. Its walls were gray. Its purpose was simple: verify identities, stop threats, move people along. Captain Lyra Vane preferred it that way. The alien woman stood inside the primary inspection hall, her deep teal skin illuminated by cold security lights. Silver hair rested neatly across one shoulder. A pulse rifle hung across her uniform, more as a symbol of authority than necessity. Most days were predictable. Cargo ships, tourists, merchants, government couriers. Nothing remarkable ever happened on the edge of civilized space. That morning seemed no different. A civilian shuttle carrying 42 passengers docked at exactly 0900 hours. The airlock opened with a metallic hiss. Travelers began filing into the processing area carrying bags, cases, and travel permits. Automated scanners swept across faces and identification chips. Names appeared. Records cleared. Passengers moved forward. Everything proceeded normally until passenger 37. The human stepped forward quietly. He appeared to be around 40 years old. White skin, short dark hair touched by gray. Worn travel jacket. One small duffel bag. Nothing unusual. Nothing impressive. Yet something about him immediately caught Lyra's attention. Not because he looked dangerous. Because he looked completely calm. Most travelers showed some sign of impatience at checkpoints. Some looked nervous. Some looked annoyed. This human looked like a man waiting for rain. Relaxed. Patient. Unconcerned. The scanner passed over him. A soft tone sounded. Then another. The display flickered. Lyra frowned. The screen should have produced a simple identification profile. Instead, the system paused. Processing icons rotated across the display. Several seconds passed. The line behind the human grew longer. He waited without complaint. Finally, a partial record appeared. Name: Ethan Walker. Species: human. Citizenship: Earth Alliance Registry. The remaining sections were blank. Lyra frowned again. That should have been impossible. Modern databases did not simply leave information missing. Travel history, security status, employment background, medical records. Every interstellar traveler possessed a complete profile. Ethan Walker had almost nothing. Please place your hand on the scanner again, Lyra said. The human complied immediately. Another scan. Same result. Partial file. Incomplete record. Security flags remained absent, yet the missing data generated a warning. Lyra glanced up. Ethan met her gaze calmly. Problem, he asked. His voice carried the relaxed tone of someone asking about the weather. Possibly, Lyra replied. Around them, travelers continued moving through adjacent checkpoints. Security drones floated silently overhead. Beyond the station windows, distant stars burned against the darkness. Lyra initiated a deeper verification request. The computer responded with another delay. That never happened. Not on border systems connected directly to the Imperial network. For the first time all morning, she felt genuine curiosity. Ethan shifted his duffel bag slightly, but otherwise remained motionless. No anxiety, no frustration, no urgency, just patience. The display finally flashed a message. Additional authorization required. Lyra stared at the screen, then at the human, then back at the screen. Passenger 37 suddenly became the only person in the station who mattered. And somewhere deep inside the station's ancient servers, a file nobody had opened in years was beginning to wake up. Captain Lyra Vane had processed thousands of travelers during her career. Smugglers lied. Couriers exaggerated. Tourists complained. Politicians demanded special treatment. Experience taught her that unusual behavior often meant hidden problems. Ethan Walker displayed none of those signs. That was precisely what bothered her. The human remained standing beside the inspection terminal while the station's systems continued struggling with his file. Around them, the passenger line gradually disappeared. Travelers collected their belongings and moved toward customs gates. Within 15 minutes, the busy checkpoint had become almost empty. Only Ethan remained. He showed no impatience, no concern, no attempt to ask for special treatment. He simply waited. The silence felt strange. Lyra studied him carefully from behind her terminal. Years of border service had sharpened her instincts. Most people revealed themselves through small details. Nervous hands, restless eyes, defensive posture. Ethan revealed nothing. He stood comfortably with one hand resting on his duffel bag. His gaze occasionally drifted toward the station windows where distant stars shimmered against the darkness. He looked less like a traveler under investigation and more like someone enjoying the view. The system emitted another tone. Lyra checked the display. Additional verification remained in progress. Estimated completion time, unknown. That message alone was alarming. Imperial databases rarely experience delays. Border systems were designed to access information across hundreds of worlds within seconds. Unknown completion times belonged to outdated archives or heavily restricted records. Neither possibility made sense. Ethan appeared completely ordinary. "Have you traveled through Imperial space before?" Lyra asked. The human nodded slightly. "A few times. Recently, not for several years." His answers were short but polite. He never sounded evasive. Yet he never volunteered extra information either. Lyra folded her arms. "Business or personal travel?" "Personal." "Destination?" "Kari's Prime." "Reason?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Visiting an old friend." The answer sounded genuine. That somehow made it even more frustrating. Nothing about the conversation justified the warnings appearing on her screen. Nearby, two junior officers quietly observed from a secondary station. They had noticed the unusual verification request as well. One officer attempted a separate database search. The result produced the same delay. The second officer frowned. "Captain, I cannot access his historical records either." Lyra nodded without taking her eyes off Ethan. The human heard the comment, but showed no reaction. No surprise. No concern. As though he already expected this to happen. That thought unsettled her. Outside the observation window, a cargo freighter drifted past the station's docking ring. Navigation lights reflected across the inspection hall. Soft mechanical vibrations moved through the floor beneath their feet. The station felt isolated, quiet, suspended between stars and uncertainty. Lyra initiated a military archive request. Access denied. She tried a civilian registry search. Incomplete results. She attempted immigration history. Restricted. Every path led to another wall. She had never encountered anything like it. "Mr. Walker," she said carefully, "do you know why your file requires this level of authorization?" Ethan looked at the terminal, then at her. For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not fear. Not worry. Recognition. The look lasted less than a second. "I have an idea," he said. "And you are not concerned?" Another faint smile appeared. "No, Captain. I am not." The answer lingered in the room. Calm. Certain. Almost reassuring. Then the central terminal suddenly flashed bright white. Every screen in the inspection area froze. Security drones stopped moving. The station network redirected processing power toward a single database request. Lyra stared as unfamiliar symbols appeared across the display. Somewhere deep inside the Imperial Archive network, ancient records were unlocking themselves. And for the first time since Ethan Walker arrived, Captain Lyra Vane felt something she almost never experienced. Anticipation. The inspection hall became unnaturally quiet. Even the constant hum of station machinery seemed softer as every screen remained frozen on the same brilliant white glow. Captain Lyra Vane had served at border stations for nearly a decade. She had encountered fugitives, diplomats, smugglers, and military officers carrying clearance levels most civilians would never see. Nothing in her experience prepared her for what happened next. The central terminal emitted a deep tone unlike any notification she had ever heard. It sounded old, ancient, the kind of signal belonging to systems built long before modern networks existed. Across the inspection hall, status displays shifted simultaneously. Standard security interfaces vanished. New authorization symbols appeared in their place. One of the junior officers stared at his screen. "Captain," he whispered. "The station AI just elevated its own clearance level." Lyra immediately turned toward him. "That is not possible." "I know." Yet it had happened. The evidence glowed directly in front of them. Border Station 12 was no longer accessing ordinary records. It was communicating directly with the Imperial Archive Core, a database so heavily protected that most citizens believed it was merely a legend. Lyra returned her attention to Ethan Walker. The human remained exactly where he had been standing for the past 20 minutes. Calm, patient, watching the stars through the observation window. He looked like a traveler waiting for delayed luggage rather than the center of an unprecedented security event. Mr. Walker, Lyra said carefully. How long has it been since someone accessed your file? Ethan considered the question. I'm not sure. Years? Probably. Decades. The human smiled faintly. Maybe. The answer did not help. Before Lyra could ask another question, the display finally changed. Rows of encrypted text appeared across the terminal. Entire sections remained hidden beneath authorization barriers. Others displayed only classification warnings. One message stood out immediately. Archival status. Historical protection active. Lyra frowned. Historical protection was normally reserved for major events, influential leaders, or individuals whose records carried extraordinary cultural significance. Travelers did not receive historical protection. The station AI continued processing data. More information surfaced. Not enough to explain the mystery, just enough to deepen it. Birth location, Earth. Citizenship, active. Security threat assessment, none. Then another delay. Additional files attempted to load. The archive system paused again as though searching through layers of forgotten history. Lyra felt her curiosity growing stronger with every second. Ethan watched the process with quiet resignation. Not surprise. Not concern. Resignation. As though he had experienced this before. Outside the station windows, a field of distant stars stretched endlessly across the darkness. Cargo traffic moved silently between navigation beacons. Everything beyond the checkpoint continued normally. Inside the hall, however, time seemed suspended. Then the terminal flashed red. Not a warning. Not an alert. A security seal. Ancient imperial symbols rotated across the display. The junior officers stepped back instinctively. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. She had only seen that seal in military history courses. It belonged to Omega clearance archives. Records sealed at the highest level available to civilian authorities. Slowly, one final authorization barrier began to unlock. Letters appeared across the screen one at a time. Not a biography, not a security report, just a designation. The system seemed almost reverent as it revealed the information. Ethan finally glanced away from the stars and looked toward the terminal. His expression softened slightly, not because he was proud, because he recognized what was coming. Lyra leaned forward. Every officer in the room did the same. Somewhere inside the deepest vaults of the Imperial Archive core, a forgotten chapter of galactic history had just opened its first page. The first name appeared without warning. Ethan Walker. For a moment, Captain Lyra Vane wondered if she had somehow reached the wrong file. Nothing about the name seemed remarkable. Nothing explained why an entire border station had effectively surrendered control to a dormant archive system. Then the next line loaded. Lyra's eyes narrowed. The junior officers moved closer. The station AI remained silent as additional information emerged from layers of encrypted historical records. Status, verified. Classification, Omega archival protection. Access level, restricted by Imperial decree. A chill moved through the inspection hall. Imperial decrees were not attached to ordinary citizens. They were reserved for individuals connected to events significant enough to alter history itself. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. She continued reading. More text appeared. Not rapidly. Slowly. As though the archive wished every word to be understood. Historical record access approved. Viewer discretion advised. One of the junior officers whispered something under his breath. Another stepped away from the terminal entirely. Nobody in the room seemed willing to interrupt the process. Ethan remained silent. The human watched the screen with an expression that looked strangely familiar. Not pride. Not excitement. It looked like someone opening an old photograph he had not seen in many years. The archive finally displayed the next section. A date appeared. 41 years earlier. Then another. 38 years earlier. Then another. Entire decades stretched across the screen. Lyra frowned. Most active travel records contained recent information. This file reached far beyond ordinary documentation. Then came a designation. United Earth Rescue Command. Lyra blinked. The term felt familiar. Very familiar. Somewhere in her education, she had heard it before. History lessons. Military archives. Ancient documentaries. She searched her memory. The answer remained just beyond reach. The terminal continued revealing information. Operational status, retired. Decorations, classified. Strategic authorizations, sealed. Survivor registries, cross-referenced. Survivor registries. That phrase struck her immediately. People were not normally cross-referenced with survivor registries unless they had been connected to major evacuation events. Lyra's gaze shifted toward Ethan. The human appeared older suddenly. Not physically, contextually, like someone standing beneath the weight of years nobody else could see. Outside the station windows, stars drifted silently across the darkness. Inside the hall, nobody spoke. The archive revealed another section. This time an image appeared. The photograph was old, grainy, captured during an era when modern holographic recording systems were still developing. Hundreds of rescue vessels filled the frame. Emergency beacons glowed against a damaged sky. At the center stood a younger version of Ethan Walker wearing a simple command uniform. Lyra stared. One of the officers inhaled sharply. The station AI finally spoke for the first time since the archive activation. Historical reference located. Its voice echoed through the inspection hall. Cross-match successful. Additional data surfaced immediately. Thousands of related records. Memorial entries. Evacuation logs. Civilian preservation archives. The sheer volume overwhelmed the terminal display. Lyra felt a strange sensation in her chest. Recognition was beginning to form. She still did not know exactly who Ethan Walker was. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the file of an ordinary traveler. This was the file of someone history had refused to forget. Ethan looked away from the screen and back toward the stars beyond the station glass. His expression softened, almost sadly, as though the archive was not revealing achievements, as though it was reopening memories. And somewhere inside the deepest vaults of the Imperial Archive core, the next page was already waiting to explain why entire civilizations had preserved his name for more than 40 years. Captain Lyra Vane finally remembered where she had heard the name. Not Ethan Walker. The organization. United Earth Rescue Command. The memory surfaced from a history lecture she attended as a cadet nearly 15 years earlier. The instructor had called it one of the greatest humanitarian operations ever recorded. At the time, Lyra had paid little attention. Most cadets preferred studying famous admirals and military campaigns. Rescue fleets sounded less exciting. Standing inside Border Station 12, she suddenly wished she had listened more carefully. The archive continued revealing information. New images appeared across the terminal. Entire worlds filled the screen. Massive evacuation corridors stretching across the darkness of space. Emergency shelters illuminated by thousands of landing beacons. Endless rows of civilian transport ships moving through danger towards safety. Every image carried the same insignia. United Earth Rescue Command. Lyra read silently. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the station itself. Population evacuated, 8. 3 million. Population evacuated, 14. 7 million. Population evacuated, 22. Per million. The numbers continued climbing. Every operation ended with the same notation. Mission successful. One of the junior officers lowered himself into a chair without realizing he had done it. Another stared openly at the screen. No one attempted to hide their shock anymore. Then the archive reached the section labeled Orion Crisis Response. Even Lyra recognized that name immediately. Every schoolchild in the Empire knew about the Orion Crisis. Entire star systems had faced extinction after a chain of catastrophic stellar instabilities forced emergency evacuations across multiple inhabited worlds. History books described it as one of the largest civilian rescue efforts ever attempted. The terminal displayed a recording recovered from historical archives. Grainy footage filled the screen. Thousands of frightened civilians moved toward transport zones beneath darkening skies. Rescue ships descended through clouds. Emergency personnel guided families toward safety. In the center of the recording stood a human officer issuing instructions while coordinating hundreds of vessels simultaneously. Ethan Walker. Younger. Exhausted. Focused. Determined. Lyra glanced toward the human standing beside the checkpoint window. The difference between then and now seemed impossible. The man in the recording carried responsibility for millions of lives. The traveler beside her carried a duffel bag and wore an old jacket. Yet they were unquestionably the same person. The archive continued. Command authority granted during Orion crisis. Emergency coordination oversight confirmed. Survivor preservation statistics attached. Lyra opened the attached records. Her breath caught. More than 30 million civilians had survived because evacuation routes remained operational during the most dangerous phase of the crisis. Entire colonies existed today because somebody had refused to abandon them. Entire generations had been born because rescue fleets arrived on time. Entire civilizations had continued because someone kept coordinating ships when systems around him were collapsing into chaos. The archive never used heroic language. It simply listed facts. Somehow that made the truth more powerful. Lyra felt her perspective shifting with every line she read. The human beside her was not merely a veteran. He was a living piece of history. Yet Ethan showed no sign of pride, no attempt to draw attention to himself. He stood quietly watching the stars beyond the station glass, almost as though he wished the archive would stop talking about him altogether. Then Lyra reached the final entry in the Orion files. She froze. The notation contained no statistics, no operational summaries, no commendations, just a simple statement entered 40 years earlier. Recommendation: galactic honor status. Recipient response: declined. The inspection hall became silent again. Lyra slowly looked toward Ethan Walker. For the first time, she understood why the archive had hidden his file. Not because history wanted to protect a legend, because history was protecting a man who never wanted to become one. Captain Lyra Vane could have completed the inspection right then. The travel authorization requirements had already been satisfied. The identity verification process was no longer in question. Technically, Ethan Walker was free to continue toward customs and leave the station behind. Yet nobody moved. The archive remained open. The inspection hall remained silent. And Lyra found herself staring at the final recommendation that had been declined 4 decades earlier. Galactic honor status. Declined. The words felt impossible. Entire governments spent fortunes chasing recognition. Military officers devoted lifetimes pursuing medals. Politicians built careers around public admiration. Ethan Walker had apparently walked away from the highest civilian honor ever offered by multiple civilizations. Lyra slowly turned toward him. Why? The question escaped before she realized she had spoken aloud. Ethan looked away from the stars and toward her. For several moments he said nothing. The station lights reflected softly across the observation windows. Cargo traffic drifted beyond the glass. The universe continued moving while the border station seemed frozen in place. Finally, Ethan smiled. It was not the smile of a famous hero. It was the smile of a tired man remembering something old. Because the award belonged to the people who did not come home. Nobody answered. Even the junior officers remained perfectly still. Ethan stepped closer to the terminal and glanced at the historical images displayed across the screen. Rescue fleets, emergency shelters, evacuation corridors. Millions of lives represented by tiny entries in a database. History likes simple stories, he said quietly. Real life is usually more complicated. Lyra listened carefully. Something told her the archive was revealing only part of the truth. Ethan touched one of the old photographs. A transport vessel appeared enlarged on the screen. It looked small compared to the enormous rescue armadas surrounding it. That ship carried 12,000 civilians. His voice remained calm. The captain kept flying evacuation routes long after most people thought the mission was impossible. Another image appeared. A medical transport. The crew aboard that vessel worked for 4 days without sleep. Another image. Another ship. Another crew. None of those people received documentaries. Ethan looked toward the stars again. Most of them never expected to. The inspection hall felt different now. The archive no longer seemed like a monument to one man's achievements. It felt like a memorial to countless acts of quiet courage. Lyra understood something she had missed before. Every time the records mentioned Ethan Walker, they also mentioned hundreds of others. Pilots, engineers, medical teams, navigation specialists, ordinary people doing extraordinary work together. Ethan never described himself as the center of the story. The archive had. He never did. One of the junior officers finally found his voice. Then why keep your file protected? Ethan laughed softly. I did not ask for that either. The answer surprised everyone, including Lyra. The human shrugged slightly. Some governments thought too many people would turn history into mythology. He glanced at the terminal. They wanted facts preserved instead. Another notification appeared across the archive screen. Additional records remained available. Thousands of pages. Millions of names. Entire chapters of galactic history waiting to be explored. Yet Lyra no longer felt interested in statistics. She was looking at the man behind them. For the first time since Ethan Walker entered Border Station 12, she understood the true mystery. The remarkable part was not that history remembered him. The remarkable part was that he had spent 40 years trying to live as though history belonged to everyone else. And as the station lights reflected across the ancient archive, Captain Lyra Vane began to realize that the final page of the file might be far more important than all the pages that came before it. The final page opened without fanfare. No dramatic warning. No ceremonial seal. Just a simple document hidden beneath thousands of historical records. Captain Lyra Vane expected another list of operations, another archive entry, another statistic measuring the scale of events she could barely comprehend. Instead, she found a personal statement. The text was short, remarkably short compared to everything that came before it. She began reading silently. Request submitted. Removal from public historical registry tours. Request submitted by Ethan Walker. Reason provided. History should belong to those who lived through it, not those who survived it. Lyra stared at the sentence. Around her, the inspection hall remained silent. Even the station AI seemed unwilling to interrupt. The words felt heavier than every evacuation figure she had read earlier. They carried no achievement, no recognition, no glory, only humility. She continued reading. Additional correspondence appeared beneath the statement. Government officials had rejected portions of the request. Educational archives insisted his name remain preserved. Historical institutions argued future generations deserved access to accurate records. The debate had lasted years. Yet throughout every document, Ethan's responses remained consistent. Preserve the facts. Honor the crews. Remember the civilians. Do not make heroes where ordinary people simply did their jobs. Lyra slowly lowered her gaze from the terminal. Ethan stood quietly near the observation window. The stars beyond the glass reflected in his eyes. For the first time, she realized something profound. Every person she had ever studied in history seemed larger than life. Larger than ordinary people. Larger than reality itself. Ethan Walker felt exactly the opposite. The more she learned about him, the more human he became. The archive had uncovered no legend. It had uncovered a man who never stopped seeing himself as part of a larger whole. Then another file appeared. Final Imperial Review. Lyra opened it. The document originated 37 years earlier. She read carefully. Recommendation: Permanent Honor Classification. Status: Approved. Additional directive: in the event of future identification verification, all Imperial personnel are advised to extend formal recognition of service rendered to the preservation of civilian populations throughout the Orion crisis and associated evacuation operations. Lyra stopped breathing for a moment. Formal recognition. Not required. Advised. The distinction mattered. Respect could not be ordered. It could only be earned. Slowly she looked around the inspection hall. Every officer had read the same directive. Every face carried the same expression. Not shock anymore. Understanding. The station lights reflected across polished floors. Security drones hovered motionless overhead. Outside, distant stars burned against the endless darkness. Ethan finally noticed the silence behind him and turned. His expression remained calm, curious, almost apologetic, as though he regretted causing inconvenience. That simple reaction settled something inside Lyra. She thought about the millions of names hidden within the archive. She thought about the worlds that still existed because rescue fleets arrived when hope was running out. She thought about a man who had refused titles, refused honors, refused attention, and spent decades traveling the galaxy anonymously. Then she made her decision. Slowly, Captain Lyra Vane stepped away from the inspection terminal. The sound of her boots echoed across the quiet hall. She stopped several feet in front of Ethan Walker. Her hands moved to the security rifle resting across her uniform. With deliberate care, she disengaged the carry lock and lowered the weapon until its barrel pointed harmlessly toward the floor. Then, before anyone could speak, she lowered herself onto one knee. The entire station watched. And for the first time in 40 years, The forgotten hero standing beside the stars looked genuinely surprised. For several seconds, nobody moved. Captain Lyra Vane remained kneeling. Her lowered weapon rested against the polished floor. The station lights reflected across its surface in thin bands of silver and blue. Around her, the inspection hall stood completely silent. The junior officers watched without speaking. Even the distant hum of machinery seemed muted beneath the weight of the moment. Ethan Walker looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Captain," he said softly, "that is not necessary." Lyra lifted her eyes. "With respect, sir, I believe it is." The human sighed, not with annoyance, with the familiar weariness of someone who had encountered this situation before and never learned how to feel about it. Slowly, he stepped closer. "Please stand." Lyra hesitated. Then she rose to her feet. Yet the atmosphere did not return to normal. Something fundamental had changed. The checkpoint no longer felt like a border inspection facility. It felt like a place where history had unexpectedly walked through the front door. Ethan glanced toward the archive terminal. Thousands of records remained visible, millions of lives represented by names, numbers, and preserved memories. He studied them quietly before speaking again. "You know what the strange part is?" No one answered. Ethan smiled faintly. "People always assume those records make me proud." He looked toward the stars beyond the observation windows. "Most days they make me sad." The honesty of the statement settled over the room. Lyra listened carefully. She sensed that the archive had finally reached the most important chapter. Not the public history, the personal one. Ethan folded his hands behind his back. His voice remained calm. "Every evacuation report tells you how many people survived." He nodded toward the screen. "That is good. Those numbers matter." His gaze softened. "But numbers leave things out." The station lights reflected in the glass beside him. For a moment he appeared older than ever. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying decades of memories. "History remembers successful missions," he continued. "It remembers ships that arrived on time." He paused. "What it does not remember are the conversations afterward." Nobody interrupted. Ethan looked down briefly. The families searching passenger manifests. The children asking whether someone was coming back. His voice never broke. Yet every word carried weight. The people who survived still had to keep living. Lyra felt her chest tighten. For the first time, she understood why Ethan avoided recognition. The archive preserved outcomes. He remembered individuals. To everyone else, the Orion crisis was a historical event. To him, it remained personal. One of the junior officers finally spoke. "Then why keep traveling?" Ethan looked surprised by the question. Then he laughed softly. "Because staying still never felt right." He glanced toward the stars. "There is always another world to see, another friend to visit." His expression brightened slightly. And thankfully, most border stations do not open ancient archives. A few quiet smiles appeared throughout the room. Even Lyra found herself smiling. The tension that had dominated the checkpoint for the past hour finally began to ease. Ethan looked toward the terminal one last time. "History is important," he said, "but it should never become a prison." Then he reached forward and closed the archive file. The massive database disappeared instantly. The countless records faded from view. The terminal returned to its ordinary inspection interface. Just like that, the legend vanished, leaving only a traveler standing beside a window full of stars. Yet Captain Lyra Vane knew something had changed forever. Not because she had discovered a famous name, because she had finally met the human being hidden behind it. And as the station systems slowly returned to normal, one final truth remained waiting just beyond the checkpoint gates. The customs gate stood open. Beyond it stretched the transit corridor leading toward the surface shuttles of Kari's Prime. Travelers passed through that corridor every day without giving it a second thought. Today it felt different. Today it felt significant. Ethan Walker adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and prepared to continue his journey. The inspection hall had returned to normal on the surface. Terminals functioned again. Security drones resumed their patrol routes. Network traffic flowed through the station exactly as before. Yet everyone present understood that nothing was quite the same. Captain Lyra Vane stood beside the checkpoint terminal watching the human prepare to leave. Part of her wanted to ask more questions. Hundreds of them. About the rescue fleets. About the worlds he had helped preserve. About the years after the Orion crisis. But she knew none of those questions truly mattered. The archive had already revealed the facts. What mattered was the lesson hidden beneath them. Ethan paused before the gate, and looked back. His expression carried the same quiet kindness she had noticed when he first arrived. Long before the archive, long before the revelations, long before history entered the room. "Thank you for doing your job, Captain," he said. Lyra blinked in surprise. "I should be thanking you." Ethan smiled. "No." He glanced around the station. "People trust Borders because someone stands here every day making difficult decisions." His gaze returned to her. "That matters more than you think." The words settled into the silence between them. Coming from anyone else, they might have sounded polite. Coming from him, they felt meaningful. Lyra straightened instinctively. Not because of rank, not because of protocol, because respect had become mutual. One of the junior officers stepped forward. Then another. Neither spoke. They simply stood quietly beside their captain. Ethan understood immediately. He nodded once. A gesture of gratitude. Nothing more. Nothing less. Then he turned and began walking toward the transit corridor. His footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. The station lights reflected off the windows overlooking the stars. Beyond the glass, countless worlds waited in the darkness. Worlds filled with people who would never know he had passed through Border Station 12. Worlds that continued existing because ordinary individuals had once chosen responsibility over recognition. Halfway to the gate, Ethan stopped. Not because someone called out. Because he noticed something outside the observation window. A small civilian transport vessel was approaching the station. Its navigation lights shimmered against the blackness of space. Ethan watched it for a moment and smiled. A simple smile. The kind people wear when looking at something beautiful. Then he continued walking. The gate recognized his authorization and opened fully. No alarms sounded. No ceremonies followed. No announcements echoed through the station. History did not leave accompanied by applause. It simply picked up a duffel bag and moved on. Captain Lyra Vane remained standing long after he disappeared from sight. Around her, the station slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. New passengers arrived. New ships docked. New inspections began. Yet something had changed inside her. She would remember the archive, of course. She would remember the rescue fleets and the millions of lives preserved across decades. But eventually, she realized those were not the memories that would stay with her the longest. The memory she would carry was much simpler. A traveler standing beside a window full of stars. A man who never asked for recognition. A man who spent 40 years giving credit to others. A man who taught an entire border station that greatness and humility could exist in the same person. Outside, the stars continued shining across the endless darkness. Inside, Captain Lyra Vane looked toward the empty corridor and quietly lowered her head in respect. Not because regulations required it. Not because history demanded it. But because sometimes the greatest thing a person can do is remain human after the galaxy gives them every reason not to.